Welcome to another edition of Secrets from the Ancient Past. I'm Andy Cook. We're in a special series that I'm calling The Search for God's Own Heart. In the Bible, David is known as a young man who was after God's own heart. It was an amazing thing to say about someone so young. Later on, David became known as the greatest king in Israel's history. But when he was young, when he was just getting started on the search for God's own heart, he was a shepherd. It's not surprising that David's family had sheep or that the sons of Jesse were expected to watch after those sheep. Bethlehem has long been home to shepherds and their families. Visit Israel today and you'll find plenty of shepherds walking through all parts of Israel, including in the fields of Bethlehem or the streets of Jericho. You can find them in the hills of Samaria. There are the gentle pasture lands of the Shephelah, the foothills of the Judean mountains. Shepherds come in all ages. They are male and female. They walk with their flocks, though some ride donkeys. Shepherds and their flocks seem always to be on the move. The land of Israel has very few areas of lush pasture land where shepherds can freely wander, so you'll find many of them in the rocky lands of the mountains, the Judean wilderness, or the Benjamin desert. It's in this environment where a good shepherd will lead his flock to find good grass and fresh water. It's the shepherd who will protect his vulnerable sheep from predators and from a sheep's tendency to hurt himself. The image of shepherds and their flocks was so common in ancient times, the writers of the Bible used this imagery of guiding a flock to speak of Israel's leaders. Both the spiritual and the political leaders of Israel were supposed to be shepherds of God's people. Not surprisingly, some of those shepherds were really good, and some were really bad. According to the prophet Ezekiel, God eventually ran out of patience with the political and religious leaders of Judah, with those bad shepherds of Judah. The day will come, Ezekiel said, again repeating what he had heard from God, when God himself would become Israel's shepherd. Ezekiel said it was the Lord who would rescue his own sheep, the Lord who would gather them, the Lord who would give them their own land. The Lord would one day tend to the wounds of his people. God would heal them, find those who were lost, give them a place to rest, and destroy those who had treated his sheep so carelessly. In fact, because there had been so many bad shepherds, God said, I'm going to come and be the ultimate good shepherd. Now, don't miss the impact of that prophetic message or the impact of the day when Jesus announced to those around him, I am the good shepherd. Wait a minute. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd? Was Jesus really taking on the mantle of what Ezekiel had promised centuries before? Well, look at the context of the passage, and you will see that Jesus was, at that very moment, struggling with some of the religious leaders of Israel, the shepherds of Israel. Jesus was incredibly frustrated with those who were supposed to be shepherding God's people. And the way they heard what Jesus said, Jesus was saying, hey, you're part of the problem here. You're in the line of bad shepherds. In fact, you're such bad shepherds, I've kept my promise and come here and I will be the ultimate good shepherd. I'm going to do this. That's what God said and that's why I'm here. Now, if you don't quite see that what Jesus said was quite that inflammatory, just watch the religious leaders who heard him say it in person. They made plans to kill Jesus. Oh, but back to David, the man after God's own heart. We're in this search for God's own heart. David's earliest job was keeping sheep, just watching sheep, caring for sheep. He developed, whether he knew it or not, leadership skills among his sheep and a personality that would eventually help him become a great political leader. He would learn to know patience because of his sheep. He would learn how to think ahead and to provide for others because of his work with his flock. He would know courage because of the enemies that had come against his sheep. We know that he had killed a lion and a bear early on, something I'll bet very few boys in any generation have ever done, ever been able to say. But as David learned to fight for his sheep, he was also learning how to fight for his people years later. And lest we forget, with all that time on his hands, there's no doubt that young David whittled the hours away learning how to sling a stone and how to play his harp. When he was a teenager, David probably did not see all of that time as a shepherd as being a very exciting job. He must have been lonely much of the time. He surely felt a bit invisible, even in his own family. But he kept being faithful, doing what it appeared God wanted him to do, right where God wanted him to be. Now remember, this was the time of life when David became a person God complimented in a very powerful way. David, God told Samuel, was a man after my own heart. But David was just a teenager. Now listen, the jump from David's life to your own life should not be too difficult, even if you're not a teenager. This is easy Bible application. If you're frustrated because you don't feel like where you're meant to be, perhaps God is still teaching you skills like patience, vision, and courage. Perhaps the pain of this season will provide benefits for the next season of your life. David did not become king until he was 30 years old. In fact, he wasn't king in Jerusalem until he was closer to 40. Those years between childhood and when he finally became king were very hard. It was frustrating. He dealt with loneliness. He had some big enemies. And sometimes, as you know, he was his own worst enemy. But all along the way, David was being shaped by God for the task that lay ahead. You know, the same may be true for you right now. I'll close with a very nice image that comes from a hidden refuge not far from Bethlehem. It's called the Pratt Nature Preserve. Tucked away on the southern edge of the Benjamin Desert, this nature preserve is a place where it's easy to imagine the shepherd bringing his flock here. It must have looked like paradise to someone like David and his sheep. There's a wonderful supply of grass at Pratt. There are pools of fresh water there. Maybe it was here that David came up with the wonderful words that have meant so much to so many in the last 3,000 years. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside the quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for His name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. And you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Andy Cook.